I am absolutely delighted to be joined today by a legend. He really needs no introduction, but I'll give him a bit of one anyway. He's a comedian, writer, and broadcaster, and the man behind the satirical X/Twitter character Titani McGrath. He's well known for his stand-up performances on the Edinburgh Fringe and at Comedy Unleashed, and he's also, up until recently, a familiar face on GB News. He is, of course, Andrew Doyle. Andrew, thank you very much for making the time today.
My pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you. Now, Andrew, there's a chap called Dominic Frisby who I know you know well, and
Yes.
he's someone I've been a fan of for many years. And he did a song, he's done many songs. One of the songs he did a year or two ago was called We're All Far Right Now, which is a great song, and it really highlights how far things have shifted. Now, I had a flick through the most recent report from the Hope Not Hate people and the State of Hate, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I
Yes.
notice you're not in it yet, but surely you can't be far away
I
from it.
mean, yeah. Well, Hope Not Hate are complete frauds and completely intolerant of any kind of disagreement, and they're not honest brokers, and they went after GB News, for instance. They're very angry about GB News, the idea that people have conversations that they don't approve of. They are basically authoritarians. I think it was the head of Hope Not Hate that put out this false claim that during the summer riots there were attacks, weren't there, that weren't going on. He was talking about attacks on Muslims that weren't happening, acid attacks, I believe. And he later deleted it and acknowledged that it wasn't real. But given that so many people have gone to prison for offensive memes or misinformation surrounding the riots,
Mm.
stirring up further trouble, you would have thought he would have been had his collar felt as well. But that just shows that there's a kind of it's not a balanced approach to justice. But yes, certainly Dominic's
Yeah.
song. I think Dominic's song was retweeted by Elon Musk, so it became that one became a particularly big thing. And the reason I think it became so popular is that most of us have been accused of being far right for having perfectly legitimate mainstream opinions,
Yeah.
uh, which is a kind of maddening experience. If all you're saying is that men shouldn't be in women's sports or that men, shouldn't be in women's spaces, and you're suddenly being called far right and fascist, or if you think you should have a sensible migration policy, and you're suddenly being called far right and fascist, and the song works because the term is meaningless. It's been misapplied so often that it doesn't mean anything anymore. Like terms like racist, sexist, homophobic, whereas those used to mean something. They used to mean, someone who has genuine hatred or animosity towards a particular group on the basis of a demographic characteristic. Now it just means someone I don't like very much.
Yeah, those terms have become, yeah, I absolutely agree, they've become meaningless. A friend of mine recently looked up the definition for Islamophobe, because you've got to nail down these definitions. If you're going to slander someone and assign a label to them, it's really quite important for you to know what that label is. And
Yes.
he looked up the definition of Islamophobe, and I haven't verified this myself, but he said that in the Oxford Dictionary, the definition was fear or hatred of Islam or Muslims, which then, of course,
Yeah.
leads us to four definitions. It's either a fear of Muslims or a fear of Islam, or a hatred of Islam, hatred of Muslims. There's four potential definitions there.
Yeah.
So you
But the,
can be
but the,
both
but the,
Islamophobic and not Islamophobic simultaneously.
the, the ambiguity is deliberate. The term was an invention, and it was propagated largely by Islamic theocrats in Iran, and various activists over here. The point is to silence dissent quite explicitly. If you call something a phobia, you're essentially pathologizing it. You're not saying that's a legitimate difference of opinion. What you're saying is this person is mentally ill and crazy, and this idea is completely beyond the scope. And so the vagueness of the definition is important because what they want to do there is conflate the kind anti-Muslim hatred. So somebody, for instance, who might attack someone if they're dressed in traditional Muslim attire or vandalize a mosque, right? You've got those criminal activities which are, which I think should be best described as anti-Muslim hatred. They want to conflate that with people who have legitimate grievances about Islam as a belief system, who don't believe that women are second-class citizens, who don't believe that gay people should be thrown off buildings,
Mm.
etc. And those two things are not the same. You end up by putting, this umbrella term Islamophobic, and within that, you have the kind of idiot who would smash up the windows of a mosque, conflated with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is continually receiving death threats for being an apostate from Islam. I mean, I've interviewed her. She's had to go around with security wherever she goes. She's an incredibly courageous,
Mm.
um, a brilliant thinker, and she's been told that she has a phobia. Well, you know what? If you're being pursued throughout your life with people who want to kill you, I think being afraid of that is actually quite a normal human response. So I really mistrust that term Islamophobia. There was an all-party definition or an attempted definition at Islamophobia. So this is cross-party. This is Conservatives and Labour. And the all-party report came up with Islamophobia is a form of, how did they describe it? Racism. They actually used the word. They said this is a form of racism against Muslimness and perceived Muslimness. Now,
Wow.
obviously, Islam is not a race. Being Muslim is not a race. It's not racial. It can't be because there are, 2 billion Muslims in the world of varying ethnicities,
Mm.
varying races. It's not a race. It's a belief. It's like having Marxistophobia, Marxistophobia, or
Mm.
capitalistophobia. It doesn't make any sense at all. So that really troubles me because the Labour government now is really wanting to push through their prohibition against Islamophobic hate speech, and it will likely use that definition, that bizarre, nebulous definition, which means if I say I don't think women should be veiled because I think it's rooted in misogyny, that suddenly becomes a phobia. Well, it's not. It's just a liberal point of view.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. This is the funny thing because the things you're saying now, of course, are becoming more accepted and more mainstream. I think this era of woke is somewhat over. But a couple of decades ago, your views would have been somewhere, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of somewhere left of center. You probably would have considered yourself maybe a classic liberal. And
Yeah.
these days, you're. I guess I'm right in assuming that, am I?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, I have always been and remain a liberal.
So this is the funny thing,
In,
and now you're considered far right, and it just shows. I mean, well, what do you think? Because
yeah,
the
I,
Overton window has shifted dramatically in 20 years, and I mean, it's like the speed with which things have changed, where the center ground has gone to the left. I think is really quite
I mean, to
unprecedented.
be fair, I'm not considered far right by anyone who knows me or knows anything about me
Mm,
or is a serious thinker. I'm branded as far right by people who have imagined a version of me that they think exists, or who are, politically and historically illiterate. So I'm not too worried about that label because once anyone calls me far right, they're kind of excluding themselves from any serious adult discussion because they're revealing that they don't know anything about these designations. So it
mm.
doesn't trouble me really.
Well, that's good. So you're not worried about the sort of mob coming after you and all that sort of stuff. Because I mean,
Well, they've
obviously
tried.
right.
They've tried many times, and what are they going to do? I can't be cancelled. I don't, I don't even work for GB News now, so I don't have a boss. No one's going to fire me. Not that they would have fired me at GB News for such a fatuous allegation anyway.
Mm,
Um, so I'm not. I've always been a bit privileged like that because, well, I mean, that said, if I was still a school teacher, I absolutely couldn't speak in the way that I speak. I would lose my job overnight. But the truth is, I don't. I've always been privileged because I've been able to. Part of my career has been based on saying what I think
mm,
at any given time and not having to self-censor. And I consider myself very privileged because I know that the vast majority of people aren't in that position. I don't think I can be cancelled. I just don't think that can. What are they going to do? Like, they can't stop me writing. They can't take my audience away. They can't. They can't get my books unpublished. They can try, but it's not going to happen. So,
mm.
so I'm not really concerned.
Yeah, you mentioned censorship there, and obviously we've seen the introduction of some new legislation to police on online speech, and I wonder what you think. I mean, I can obviously guess what you're going to think of this. What do you think about the people who've introduced this? I obviously know you're a big advocate for free speech. What do you think of these people, and how important is free speech for having a successful society?
I mean, it's such a massive question. I could basically talk for hours now, but I won't. I will try and condense my answer and be a bit more focused. I've always believed, well, as you know, I wrote a book called Free Speech and Why It Matters. And that, my central argument there is that free speech is the bedrock of any civilized society. It underpins all of our other freedoms. Without it, we don't have anything at all. So, you know, um, I think it really is the crux, and it's an aberration. That's the other thing. It's not. It doesn't come naturally to humankind. Authoritarianism is the norm, I think, and if you know that if you just look globally, historically, the idea of living in a society where free speech is enshrined constitutionally is so rare. That also makes it so precious, and it's also why you have to continually protect it, and you have to be vigilant against any threats, whether it comes from the left or the right, because it will come from both sides, and you have to continually defend it all the time. And it's very interesting, but that's why J.D. Vance, when he appeared at the Munich Security Conference recently, made this point about Europe. You're afraid of your own voters. You're afraid of speech. I mean, the EU just overturned that. The EU, as we know, continually goes back to various nations and says you voted the wrong way, try again. They did it in Denmark, they did it in Ireland, they did it in Greece. They're not a democratic institution. Romania, the Romanian general election was overturned on the spurious grounds that the voters were influenced by Russian bots. We had Ben Bradshaw, Labour MP in the UK, claiming that Russian bots swung Brexit. The reason why freedom of speech is under such peril at the moment in the UK is that the political class have convinced themselves that you need to control the speech of citizens in order to prevent real world harm, which is based on something that has been disproven. We know that the public doesn't act on cue to what they see on social media or in the media more generally. There have been over 6 decades of research into media effects theories. It just isn't the case that Russian bots can swing an election. It just isn't the case that misinformation, disinformation can have that impact. So they're all proceeding on the basis of something that is unevidenced, this faith that they have. But more than anything, it's just that authoritarians, the first thing they want to do is control your speech, because if they can control your speech, then by extension, they can control the parameters of acceptable thought. And of course, they can prevent criticism, which is why Erdogan in Turkey, one of the first things he did when he came to power, is to reinstate an obsolete law that enabled him to arrest or have arrested anyone who criticized him. And that has been used thousands of times against members of the public, against journalists. He even tried to get a satirist from Germany extradited for making a joke about him copulating with a goat. And disturbingly, Angela Merkel, who was then a chancellor of Germany, entertained the idea for a while until she realized, actually, no, I better not be doing that because that sets a dangerous precedent. But that, this idea that freedom of speech is something that you acquire as a society and then it's sort of there for good is a fallacy. You have to keep defending it, and particularly at the moment in the UK, where we have an authoritarian government. And bear in mind that the Conservative government that preceded it was also authoritarian, just to a different degree. I mean, the Conservative government presided over all of the worst excesses of the woke movement, which is one of the most authoritarian movements we've seen in recent years. They also introduced the online safety bill. Even that word safety comes from the woke lexicon. It's this idea that words are a form of violence, and therefore we need to be protective of mean words.
Very
So you have
Orwellian.
those things. You have the online harms bill. The Tories introduced draconian crackdowns on peaceful protest. They snuck a couple of those regulations through just before the coronation. They also had the police crime and sentencing bill, where they effectively empowered the police to stop protests if they're a bit too noisy. Well, I mean, what protest isn't inconvenient and a bit too noisy? So the Tories are authoritarian. They've never been pro-freedom. And Labour have just taken the baton and escalated the pace. Locking people up for offensive memes, offensive speech, even releasing prisoners who are violent, either sexually or physically violent, in order to make space for people who've posted something that they find offensive. So they are deeply authoritarian. They're bringing in the Islamophobia thing. Obviously, one of the first things this government did was to scotch the Freedom of Speech Higher Education Act. It's come back in a kind of watered down form, but it's relatively toothless compared to what it might have been. So they're not that, we have a real problem with Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper, of course, who wants to bring back non-crime hate incidents. The latest, which have never gone away, by the way, but the latest we've got on that is that the College of Policing are talking about just changing what it's called. So they still want the right for the police to monitor citizens on the basis of what they say, to investigate you for non-crime, but they just want to call it something else, something a bit more euphemistic, so that you don't know that your liberties are being violated. There's a real problem here in this country. The land of common law and the land of Magna Carta and the land of democracy. Now we are living in an authoritarian state. It's not a tyranny. It's not a fascist state, but that doesn't mean it's not authoritarian. In America, you had Kamala Harris's running mate, Tim Walz, explicitly say that he thought the First Amendment doesn't cover hate speech or misinformation. You know, the Biden's government, Biden's administration was deeply authoritarian. And there are elements of the Trump administration that no doubt have authoritarian impulses as well. I mean, Trump has said he wants to imprison people for burning the flag. Well, that's freedom of expression, I'm afraid. So I just don't think I'm wary of authoritarianism and crackdowns on freedom of speech, wherever they might come from, whether they might be from a political ideology or from a religious ideology or from a societal pressure, what Mill called the tyranny of custom. You just got to stand up for freedom, the right for people to be wrong, the right for people to say offensive things, and the right for you not to listen, the right for you to walk away. The problem to people saying obnoxious and offensive things on social media, the solution to that is you just block them or don't read them. And that's the problem has gone away there. The reason why everyone's trying to censor is because they believe that the problem doesn't go away there, that what happens is words are kind of like magic spells, like toxins. And if the wrong words are said, they sort of infect society and they change the word. This is a postmodernist idea, of course, the idea that language is everything. The postmodernist idea is that the way that we perceive reality is entirely anchored in the language we use to describe it, and therefore language itself is the problem, and language itself must be modified to secure social justice. So it just, I suppose what I'm saying in short is all major Western governments on the left and the right are to some degree authoritarian, and it's incumbent on those of us who care about freedom to continually make the case for freedom of speech.
Absolutely. No, so well said. Thank you for that, Andrew. I couldn't agree more. Well, you mentioned there this postmodern idea about putting so much importance on language and how language sort of determines things. Is this sort of how we get to this stage where people think that if you make a sexist comment or a lewd comment about a woman in a bar or something like this, that you're then likely to chase down a woman and rape her or something, as was the case with Sarah Everard? I don't know if you remember all the hysteria at that time. I mean, obviously,
Yes.
warranted hysteria for what happened, I suppose, but obviously it then opened up another discussion about freedom of speech and about what we should be saying and how we need to control what we say, because if we say the wrong things, that might then lead to people taking action based on that speech. A bit like if someone plays a Grand Theft Auto on the PlayStation or something, then suddenly goes out and commits real Grand Theft Auto and starts running pedestrians over and stuff like this.
Yeah, the idea there is that these kind of words normalize certain attitudes, and that's the word that they always use. They normalize concepts in society. But as I say, that we've got the research on that. We know it's not true. We know that it's the problem with violent assaults against women, as of the kind you mentioned, Sarah Everard. The problem wasn't jokes in WhatsApp groups. The problem was someone committing acts of violence. Right, that was the thing, and although in the case of that horrendous murderer, although in his case the way that he joked and the way that he interacted with people was almost certainly rooted in his violent tendencies and his objectionable perceptions of women, and all of the rest of that is true, but it is impossible to distinguish between someone who is motivated by that and therefore makes what you might call inappropriate jokes at work with people who are just bantering and are making those jokes from actually precisely the opposite worldview. I mean, I've got friends who make jokes that you would never put online because they would be they could even be arrested in the UK, but they're making those jokes as a kind of acknowledgement that we don't say things like this. Like it's almost the reverse of what a lot of the activists think. When rugby lads in groups sing songs about assault and all these sorts of things that, if you took it literally, you'd think it was absolutely horrible. The premise of it is we're saying the most shocking thing, and the most shocking thing is the thing that you mustn't think. And so, in a way, it's the exact reverse of what people think. More often than not, it's not an endorsement of those views. It's a robust rejection of those views. I think what you're describing is this kind of slippery slope concept, and it actually underpins everything about hate speech laws as they currently stand. Okay, so in the UK, I can give you a brief background. The College of Policing, which is the body that trains the police forces in England and Wales, they brought in this thing called non-crime hate incidents back in the mid 2010s, and they did it without a mandate from the government. They just did it themselves. They convinced themselves that that police in this country should be trained to monitor people for their thoughts, for their words. That's why you had that viral image of police officers standing in front of an electronic LED billboard in the north of England, which said being offensive is an offence. You know, it's why you get police tweeting out things like "Don't say offensive things, or we'll knock on your door." A lot of them have been trained by the College of Policing to think that it's their job to police legal speech that people find offensive, right? So, but it all comes, the philosophy behind it, which, by the way, has been rejected by successive governments. I should say the Home Office on a number of occasions have instructed the College of Policing to stop recording non-crime, but they've just ignored them. The High Court ruled that this was an unacceptable infringement on civil liberties. They ignored the High Court. In other words, you know, there's an argument that the College of Policing are simply acting unlawfully in their own activist interests. It's an activist group now. It's been captured. This is what the woke ideology does. It captures bodies so that they no longer are accountable to the electorate or the government. I mean, the civil service, there was a whistleblower at the civil service that said that it was common practice among civil servants to find a way to thwart or override the instructions they were given from the elected government if they didn't agree. This is what we mean when we talk about the deep state. We're talking about activist individuals in positions of power who can thwart the democratic mandate. Anyway, I'm getting off track, but the point I'm making about the hate speech and what you were saying about does banter or jokes lead to violence, and this argument that necessarily does and automatically does is baked into the hate speech legislation. It comes from this idea about, there's a book from 1954 called The Nature of Prejudice, and it's by a guy called Gordon Allport. He's a psychologist. And in this book, he came up with this 5-point scale. And if you have a look at the book, it starts at the bottom from the idea of what he calls antilocution, the idea of the discussion of prejudices. And then it goes up a notch to avoidance. In other words, when you withdraw from proximity to the group you dislike. It goes up again to discrimination, when you actively exclude those people you don't like, you try and prevent their rights. Then it goes up to the fourth level, which is physical attack, when you attack the people you don't like. And then at the top, you've got extermination, genocide. In other words, it's a slippery slope fallacy that implies that at the very bottom of the pyramid, it's become known as the pyramid of hate. At the bottom of the pyramid of hate is just biased attitudes, chatting about minority groups in a way that's a bit unpleasant. And at the top of the pyramid of hate, at the very pinnacle, is genocide. The implication being that the one leads to the other. And of course, it absolutely does not. But police have admitted in court cases, the police, the College of Policing, has been open about this is the philosophy that underpins their view, directly from the Gordon Allport Nature of Prejudice book, directly from this idea of the pyramid of hate. So,
wow,
you know, we might have arguments about postmodernist ideas about language and reality and the nexus of those two things. But the truth is that those ideas have been inculcated into all of our major political and law enforcement institutions, whether they know it or not. I don't think the College of Policing are aware that this is you know, connected to postmodernism. I don't think they thought about it that much. I think they just take for granted that this pyramid of hate is a real thing, even though, as I say, it's been completely discredited. It's not a thing. So I would just like to have a discussion. I would like to have an open discussion about why are the police enforcing the law, or their version of the law, which isn't actually the law, on the basis of a long discredited philosophy. It's really disturbing to me.
You mentioned the deep state, and I think that would be really nice to get into very briefly. I mean, it might be short-lived because it's difficult to know exactly who these sort of actors are. But, you know, you said that activists have infiltrated all these organizations and, you know, this postmodernist philosophy and this chap you just mentioned with this pyramid. You know, obviously there's a lot of funding behind some of these organizations. Is that, but who, and the people funding them, are they really the ones behind this? I mean, there's two questions, like who and why? Like why are they doing this, and who do you think it is?
It's a really good question, and I think a lot of people tend to go down the conspiratorial route when it comes to this, because I think our natural instinct is to assume that there is some kind of top-down thing going on here. Now, that's not to say that there aren't very rich people who are funding all sorts of campaigns. I mean, we saw, didn't we, just the other day, there was the discovery that some of the protests in America have been funded. You know, they're paid protests. There were adverts put out saying, "Come along, we'll pay you to be there." So look, and you know, at the Black Lives Matter riots, you know, some of those promotional materials and literature and the various materials they were using on the protests were very suspiciously. They just appeared overnight, almost as though they were there before, because there are rich people who are going to put their money into causes that they care about. But I don't think the conspiratorial route is the right way to think about this. Now, I've got friends who, since COVID in particular, have gone down these rabbit holes, and they've got to the point where they now believe any conspiracy theory at all, because they don't trust what they're being told. We now know, and we've, you know, the government, the media class, they've all been caught out in lies so often, you know, flat lies. The major medical institutions, you know, the WHO telling us that masks are useless, don't bother. Then 3 months later saying, "Oh, no, you have to wear a mask." You know, all of this. When these lies are caught, you know, when the academic class and the political class and the media class all say that the idea that the virus leaked from a lab in Wuhan is a racist conspiracy theory, and then, you know, fast forward 3 years and they all think that's probably true, actually. You know, they use that to kick people off the internet. You had prominent epidemiologists censored by the state. We know that from the Twitter files, right? So absolutely, there are powerful people, people with money, people with influence, people with power, who will exercise that power in order to get what they want from society. There's, you know, that's always been the case. That's always going to be the case. But what that does not signify is that there is a clandestine cabal of Satanists, millionaire Satanist pedophiles who run the world, who drink the blood of children, who are Jewish. It always comes back to anti-Semitism, and that they that they are the puppet masters, and they appoint all the world leaders via the WEF. You know, and they invented dinosaurs. Dinosaurs never existed. And by the way, Paul McCartney died in a car crash, and the Paul McCartney we think is alive today is actually a doppelganger. You know, every conceivable conspiracy theory is believed by these people. The truth is actually a bit more boring than that. And the truth, I think, is that a lot of these things happen by accident. Philosophies and ideas become very fashionable. They gain traction. Authoritarianism, as I said, is something that is a deep impulse within all of us. So any kind of set of ideas that would lean in towards justifying or validating the authoritarian impulse is bound to spread very quickly, because it tallies with what we secretly want. You know, people we don't like, things we don't like, we'd rather they just shut up and go away. You know, we have to be socialized out of that idea. So I mean, we talk about the long march through the institutions. It is true that Rudi Deutschke and Gramsci, this idea, there were people who were saying, and they wrote it down, we want to gradually, over many decades, infiltrate the church, academia, all of the major institutions, to effectuate a shift in the way that society is run. So that was real. Like, there were people who were planning that. Did it actually work in that way? Probably not. What actually happened is certain ideas became fashionable, gained traction in academia, and that became an escalating thing. You know, if you wanted to get promoted, you'd go along the postmodernist line because that was the fashionable thing. I've been at conferences where I can see people pretending to think things that they don't really think because they think it'll be beneficial to their career. Things escalate and cascade, and particularly ideas, particularly philosophies. That happens. So I think it's a concatenation of things. It is ideas gaining traction in society through a combination of factors, most notably fashion trends and an instantiation of that authoritarian impulse. And then that becomes exacerbated and accelerated through those who are rich enough to fund it, for those who are powerful enough to enact it in public policy, and it just becomes self-perpetuating. I think that's what's happened, but I get very nervous about those who go down these unevidenced, faith-based, conspiratorial rabbit holes, and they start to just believe utter nonsense. I mean, look, I saw that famous portrait of King Charles III, the one that, what was his name? The artist, Y-E-O, I think his name was.
I'm not sure.
He painted that portrait. I've seen the portrait close up in the palace, in Buckingham Palace, and you know, I saw all these people clipping bits of the painting and inverting them and shifting them around and saying, if you do this and you duplicate this part, you suddenly see a demon
Oh yeah,
in the
yeah.
image. And this proves that it's
I
a
actually think I've
satanic
seen what you're
cult.
talking about. Wasn't it a goat with horns or something?
A goat with horns, like some sort of
Yeah.
caprine deity of the underworld. Like this is just childish, infantile nonsense. And you know, there's a lot of this. There's a lot of this on the right. There's a lot of it from friends. I honestly, there are friends of mine who now genuinely believe this stuff. They believe that in the the paleontologists of the 18th century just cobbled together sheep bones and goat bones and made fake dinosaurs, and that was the thing, and it was all a mechanism of control. And and I just think we have to be very, very careful to retain this principle that our beliefs, although we're always going to be wrong about an awful lot of things, our beliefs have to be rooted in evidence, in that legacy of the
Mm.
Enlightenment, the idea of rationality and evidence. And we have to keep testing our beliefs on the basis of what is true and what is false. Because what those kind of right-leaning conspiratorial thinkers have in common with the woke is this complete capacity to divorce truth and fiction and to think that there are multiple truths, multiple way of knowing, not to care about the facts or the truth. And to revise history. So, I mean, the woke always do this. They always say, that these individuals were historically involved in all sorts of problematic things, which aren't true. They even
Mm.
tried to get rid of a statue of Thomas Henry Huxley, even though he was a slavery abolitionist. I mean, just nonsense stuff. They revise history that happened yesterday. We saw footage from the October the 7th pogrom in southern Israel, and they tried telling us that different things happened than we could see with our eyes. Do you remember that report about the Black Lives Matter protest in Wisconsin, where a CNN reporter was saying these are largely peaceful protests,
Of
and
course, an
behind
absolute
him there were
classic.
cars on fire. The whole
Yeah,
city was on
you couldn't
fire
make it up.
behind him. So the idea of the woke think that because of the power of language, if they say something is true, it becomes true. It doesn't need to be true. It's the words that do it. But the conspiratorial dissident right do exactly the same. They say if they say something is true, then it is true. If the world is being run by a cabal of Satanists, then it suddenly magically becomes so. I saw a viral video the other day of some guy on the dissident right. He put out a video saying, with images of the Pathé newsreels of Goebbels and the students burning books in the open Platz in Berlin, and he was saying, you look at this and you think this is bad, but these books had all come from Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexology. These were degenerate books, and maybe burning books is the right thing to do. Well, for a start, the majority of the books weren't from Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexology. A lot of them were, but they weren't all. I mean, there were books by Victor Hugo there. There were books by James Joyce there. These are not books you find on the shelves of a sexology clinic. So what they were doing was burning books that they considered to be un-German, anti-patriotic, politically dissident, as well as what they perceive to be sexually deviant, right? But what you have there is a commentator on the dissident right who's perfectly willing to fabricate history, to lie about history, because he must know, to revise history in accordance with what he would like to be true, which is that actually maybe authoritarianism, burning books is the right thing. I mistrust a lot of it, and I see it on all sides. So just to sum up, because I am going on a rant again, and I do apologize
Oh,
for
I
that,
like
but I
your
would
ranting,
say,
Andrew. Don't
can
worry.
we just get back to the primacy of truth, please, for the love of God, and the acknowledgement that we're going to be wrong about stuff. So we have to keep testing our ideas against the evidence. Like, what happened to that principle?
Here, yeah, no, empiricism and evidence, it's certainly the way to go. I mean, these people that buy into conspiracy theories, and as well, I think a lot of them, what they do is they sort of adopt a sort of package deal of sort of pre-packaged, pre-prepared views and ideas. It's a little bit like when we give people these labels like conservative, liberal. They then have to buy into the whole package and every
Oh, the
belief
whole
that comes
thing.
with it, rather than sort of actually picking and choosing what you believe based on your own research and the evidence that you've gathered. Of course, it is difficult when the government lies so
I mean, the
much, like you
conspiracy
mentioned.
stuff is absolutely, it's nuts though. I mean, some of it, I've heard former friends of mine talk about. Do you remember the Danny Boyle opening ceremony to the Olympics? Would you have seen that?
Yes, yeah.
It was the one where he had loads of. This was about, when was that? It was probably about 15 years ago, something like that, maybe 14, 13 years ago. It
2012.
was a big elaborate opening. There you go. So around
Yeah.
2012, you remember, big elaborate opening
Mhm.
ceremony, really well orchestrated. At one point in the ceremony, he had It was the one where Kenneth Branagh opened it with a line from The Tempest, from the Shakespeare play, Caliban's line, and they had a moment where all these NHS nurses are going around in this choreographed, stylized way with the beds, and it was basically a pro NHS, like isn't the NHS wonderful because it's part of what it means to be British, that kind of thing.
Well, every
But I've heard
country needs
friends
a
of mine
national
on a
religion, Andrew.
podcast. Well, yeah, well, this is it. This was it, right? So you might object to that, and look, your debates about the validity of the NHS is perfectly legit. But I heard my friends, two of my friends, or former friends, I should say, discussing on a podcast this opening ceremony, and what they said was that within this cult that runs the world, one of their rules is that you have to get permission for the things that you apply in society from the public first by showing it to them first. And they said they'd already developed the COVID pandemic. They'd already developed it, and they needed to signal this NHS thing to the world so that then they had permission to unleash it. And I think one of them even mentioned an episode of Sex and the City where one of the characters mentioned an epidemic. There was an epidemic of men or epidemic of something crazy, and she said that was them signaling doing this. There's a word for it. There's a phrase for it where these Satanists have to get permission from the public by showing it to them first,
Yeah,
and
I've
they
heard
believe
this.
it's so insane. And if you have the mind of an adult and you stop for a second, you'll know it's insane. But they're not lying. They genuinely believe the fantasies that they're coming up with. Like, it's kind of funny in a way, but except we're dealing with intelligent adults, and it just goes to show, like, intelligence isn't a protector. It's not a guarantee against indoctrination. It really isn't.
I suppose they've been lied to a lot, of course, that's part of it. But also, I think that people feel
Yeah.
very small and they feel very powerless. And as a consequence, they feel as though there's this huge, big power structure above them. And it's so big and so powerful and so well coordinated, when actually it's probably a bit of a mess with some powerful actors, some less powerful actors, and they're coalescing to sort of give the impression of some kind of great conspiracy. But I think people feel so small and powerless, and it's
100%.
probably why they prefer to buy into those sorts of ideas.
Yeah, because you cut like the woke movement, the lockdown mania, like you couldn't vote this stuff out. You couldn't, because whichever major party you voted for, you'd get it. You get the same thing. In the UK, both Tories and Labour are woke parties. It's baked into their DNA now, and so you can't. The frustration that comes with that of being continually lied to by politicians. Um, you know, this made up thing about what was it, a 3 meter rule? You got to stand a certain amount away from. It's just made
Two
up.
meters.
It's was it 2 meters? The 2 meter was
Yeah.
just completely. The idea that we all knew it. Like we were sitting there in. I remember sitting on a plane, and I was allowed to not have my mask on while I was drinking wine. So I just made the glass of wine last the whole flight, and I just thought, what? So what are we supposed to believe, that the virus just recognizes that I'm refreshing myself and therefore will be courteous enough not to spread itself? I mean, utter madness,
It was
you
quite
know,
depressing to see all
and,
that.
and
Sorry, I was just going to say the levels of compliance from the public and the unquestioning buying into these arbitrary
oh,
rules unthinkingly incredible, wasn't it, to witness?
I mean, I remember early on, I was on I used to be on the panel of the Moral Maze on Radio 4, and I remember early on in the pandemic, I went on that, and I made the case against passports, against vaccine passports. And I remember at the time getting a bit of flack for it because people were just buying into this stuff so quickly. And I was never a denier of COVID. I was never saying that this is not real. I was never doing that. I got it 3 times. I know what it's like. I lost my taste and everything's bloody horrible. I was never saying that there isn't, that there aren't precautions that can be taken, or that you shouldn't shield those who are vulnerable, because obviously people who were overweight or elderly were very much at risk, but most of us weren't at risk at all. Like the Great Barrington Declaration, which was epidemiologists saying, look, just shield the vulnerable, let everyone else get on with it. That was, of course, the way to go, and they've been vindicated by history, because someone of my age in my health wasn't at risk, was never at risk. And that's not to suggest that I couldn't have died of it, but I could have died of flu. Like, we can all die of stuff, like if we have a bad reaction. But and this was all. It was so hysterical, the idea that we couldn't have these conversations. So I totally think you're right that when people have been lied to so often, and now of course we have a media class that is lying to us and telling us that the male rapist you see on the news is actually a woman, and we're going to call him she, and we're just lied to brazenly to our face. Not just a lie, it's a lie that they know that we know they're lying. That's the worst kind of lie, because that's what authoritarians do. That's what happens in George Orwell's novel 1984. They get Winston Smith to a point where he has to say 2 + 2 = 5 and believe it. And you know, everyone there knows that's not true, but they force him into that position where he's not just saying untruths, he starts to believe untruths. And I think the gender madness is the most egregious example, where we have, you know, politicians asked, what is a woman? They know the answer. They know that we know that they know the answer, but they still pretend they don't. And think about that psychologically. I mean, they're sitting there. People like Keir Starmer saying that, you know, a
Can you
certain
remember
percentage of
verbatim what
women
he
have a
said on
penis.
LBC? I think you read it in one of your
Yeah, I mentioned it.
stand-up skits. Yeah,
I mentioned it in one of my stand-up routines. How did you know that?
I've seen it. I've watched it on YouTube.
Oh, is it on YouTube? Okay,
Yeah,
fine.
yeah, it
Okay,
is. Yeah,
I
you
can
read it
remember.
verbatim.
Nick Ferrari was interviewing Keir Starmer, and he said, "Can a woman have a penis?" And Starmer said, Nick, I'm not. I don't think we can conduct this debate with. You know, I get this. That's what he said. Rather than, no, a woman can't have a penis, because if someone's got a penis, they're a man. Which is what we know that we know that he thinks that, right? We it's so crazy, that yeah, but the fact that he's not only is he willing to lie, but he's willing to lie knowing that the public know he's lying. In other words, he's asking us to participate in a collective pretense. And I really object to that. I object to the BBC putting out their endless articles with pictures of violent men, rapists and murderers, and calling them women and calling them she, and expecting us to go along with it when the evidence of our eyes is in front of us. Because that is deeply authoritarian, and that is complete evidence that the BBC is so ideologically captured that it no longer cares about the truth. If news outlets don't care about the truth, or don't put the truth as the pinnacle of what they should be striving for, then they're no longer fit for purpose. I think the BBC should be disbanded at this point.
I think that if the BBC and other outlets and you know the government and so on are telling people lies, provable lies, and then they come up and then someone else offers an alternative that you can't disprove, in a way, that alternative, as wild as it might appear, you know, at face value, actually has a little bit more legitimacy to it if you think it in logical terms. And so you can see why people buy into these wacky ideas, because they can't
They
really
do,
disprove as easily those conspiracy theories, but they can
well,
disprove what the government's telling them and the BBC and
well,
so
also,
on.
the added problem there is, if the government is instituting hate speech laws to criminalize dissent, then of course it becomes difficult. You know, there are women who have been arrested for calling men he, right? That when that kind of thing is going on, when people are driven out of their work, like Kathleen Stock was at the University of Sussex, for pointing out that there are two sexes. You know, when you have the mechanism, the apparatus of the state against the very notion of speaking truth, then of course people are going to shut up. And because they can't defend that point, you know, because sex is binary, that is a matter of incontestable fact, and there is no, you know, no kind of casuistry or sophistry is going to get around that or change the reality. What it means is that you have to censor. The only, you know, Stonewall, who were the biggest, you know, formerly they were a gay rights group, now they're basically an anti-gay rights group, and they promote gender identity ideology. You know, they had a policy of no debate. And the reason you have to have a policy of no debate is that's what tyrants do. Tyrants give an injunction, they give a rule, they give out a decree. They don't say, let's have a discussion or a debate about it. They say, just do it. Stonewall was saying no debate because their view that we're all born with this sexed soul that may not match our body, that view cannot be sustained through serious argument or scrutiny. So they have to say no debate. Anyone who disagrees with us is a fascist. Anyone who disagrees with us shouldn't be spoken to and shouldn't be heard and should be censored. Censorship is what happens when powerful people don't want to be challenged.
On censorship, then, do you think it's something that can only really be made possible because it's a state of affairs that arises from an overextended state, I would say. If we didn't have such big government, would it really be possible? I wonder if you think that limiting the role of government would be, in part a solution to this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not for an anarchy. I think the rule of law is essential, but it should be equally applied to all citizens. And unjust laws need to be challenged. That's the other thing. It's not like the law is infallible. We know that the law is an ass. But absolutely, I think minimizing the size of the state, and although this makes me sound terribly right-wing, doesn't it? But I think the state should have nothing to do with what people choose to say or think, nothing at all. I think there are areas where the state should get involved. I think there are legitimate reasons for the state to support the most vulnerable in society. I have no problem with the welfare state. I like the welfare state. There are problems with it, and I think there are debates and discussions to be had about it. But I don't buy into this utopian idea that everyone, if they just work hard enough, they can succeed in life and they'll have no problems. That's just not true. There are some people who have just horrendous luck, are born into terrible circumstances, either health circumstances or economic circumstances, and they do require a leg up. And that, a civilized society will do that. And by the way, it benefits the rich as well to pay disproportionate taxation because, ultimately it lowers the crime rate. It makes for a more beneficial society that benefits them. So all of that stuff, well, I suppose on that regard, I sound very left wing. But when it comes to the matter of speech, I just want the government out of it. I just want them to have no say whatsoever in what people say and think. That all hate speech laws ought to be abolished, scrapped, just stripped away from the statute books. They have no place there, not least because hatred cannot be defined. No hate speech law across Europe has an identical definition of what it means. So therefore, all it is a censor's charter. All it is that you've got something on the statute books which is so nebulous that any government can lock up anyone for whatever they say, for no reason. I mean, in Ireland, when they tried to put through their latest hate speech bill, which thankfully was scuppered because of the work of free speech campaigners, but it will come back in another form. I mean, the wording of that draft bill literally said hatred means hatred. It defined hatred as hatred against minority groups. That's a circular definition. They were going to put that into law. Well, what if a future government says, we define hatred as criticism of the government? Then you've got a precedent to lock people up for simply challenging power. In Scotland, when they created their hate speech bill, which is the brainchild of Humza Yousaf, one of the most authoritarian politicians we've seen in recent years, he had a section about
He's the one that likes the color white,
people for what they say in their own home.
Sorry, I was
yeah,
going to say he's the one that likes
that
repeating
word white out
word.
again and again.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so funny because, when he brought forward this hate speech bill and it came into power on the 1st of April last year. Was it last year? I think it was. It was the 1st of April, and it was the April Fool's Day. I don't know if that was deliberate. And the police, part of the new legislation, part of the new guidelines was that the police were obliged to look into every single complaint of hate speech, which was defined, by the way, on the basis of perception of the complainant, or what they call the victim, which means that if you phone the police and say, I perceive that this person said something because he hates a particular protected characteristic, the police were obliged to look into it. They even set up hate speech recording centers in like a mushroom farm and a sex shop and all sorts of places. And then most of so you had all these trans activists on April the 1st, on the first day that the bill came into force, complaining about J.K. Rowling, trying to get J.K. Rowling arrested. They said they would do it, and they did it in their droves. But even more than that, the number one person complained about under the new hate speech law was Humza Yousaf himself. And that was because of his speech in Parliament in Holyrood. He was talking about white. He was saying that all the members of the judiciary, CEOs are white. People in politics are white. Like he spat this word out. And of course, if you spit out a word that's connected to a racial group, it sounds like racism. It sounds like you hate that race. And it was certainly perceived that way. And
what a delicious irony.
He might have reflected and thought, oh, well, I mean, he's in Scotland. Scotland is what, 96% white?
I think
maybe
like
that's why the majority of people in those positions are white. Maybe rather than everyone in Scotland is an evil racist. Maybe I'm just throwing that out there, Humza. But I thought it was Condign that he ultimately got complained about the most. It was utterly ridiculous. On that day, on April the 1st, we tested it. I've got, as you mentioned, my Comedy Unleashed night, which is a monthly night in London, but we also do nights in Leeds and Manchester as well. And we took a special Comedy Unleashed show to Edinburgh on April the 1st to coincide with the introduction of the new hate speech bill to test it. We went on stage, we told some offensive jokes. Most of the show's online actually on our YouTube Comedy Unleashed channel. And I just thought it would have been delicious if we would have been dragged off the stage and put into a prison cell. But the thing is that it was a real concern there was quite a lot of publicity about us going up there and doing it, and there were articles about it in the press. And I got contacted by people saying, don't take your mobile phone with you, because if you're going to take it, make sure the facial lock is off,
Oh
so the
yeah.
police can't just hold it up in front of your face and get into your private messages. People were basically telling me to start behaving like a drug dealer, like a criminal, just because I wanted to go and tell some jokes. That is such a sad state of affairs. Scotland is, thankfully the SNP's dominance has been broken, but it was for a long time a one-party state, and they were the most authoritarian of all the parties in the UK. Introducing their named persons scheme, where they wanted every child born in Scotland to have a state guardian. How chilling is that?
Oh,
I know that got overturned by the courts, but gee, I mean, that's these are not people you want in power. You really don't. Scary stuff.
yeah, that really is. I mean, state overreach sort of dialed up to 11. It is really worrying.
Well, by the way, they also had a section in the bill on public performance of a play. So if you were to put on a play that was perceived to be stirring up hatred against a protected characteristic, you could arrest. Certainly, the police would investigate, maybe shut down the production until the
So the,
investigation could be concluded. So that is obviously something that can be weaponized by any activist who wants to cause trouble for someone they don't like. And they do it all the time. Trans activists will phone the police and say they perceive that something that someone has said has been hateful.
so the onus
And
is on
the
us, the
process is
public.
the punishment.
The onus is on us, the
Sorry?
public. The onus is on us, the public, to know what it is that other people may perceive about the things we say. So it's a really great responsibility we all
Yeah.
have, isn't it? I mean,
Well,
wow.
yeah, we have to be telepathic. We have to know how all of our words will be interpreted. You know, the simple solution is the liberal solution. It's the most elegant solution, which is that anyone can say whatever the hell they want, and anyone can choose to listen or not. And that's it. Or like something someone has said, you can protest, you can criticize, you can ignore, you can mock. Right? That's what you do in a liberal system. If your instinct is to phone the police and get that person arrested, or put through some kind of torturous, extended, protracted legal wrangling to inconvenience them as much as possible, then you are an authoritarian. That is your instinct. Just own it. Stop saying you're on the right side of history.
This is the funny thing, of course, about the left-right divide is that we imagine in most the way that most people describe people's politics and the political spectrum, you've got communism on the left and fascism on the right. But really, I view that more as a circle because both of those are authoritarian regimes. So where does it leave the people who actually think we should be free and have a limited government? And of course, the authoritarian, the
Yeah.
version that we've got at the moment is very much a left-wing one. But it's right and left. It's still authoritarianism at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. But this is why I keep saying, like, the culture war has been misunderstood as a question of left versus right. It never was that.
No.
It just so happens that the majority of woke activists conceive themselves as left wing. But I even question that insofar as, well, firstly, I would say that authoritarianism is something that is common to the left and the right. That's obviously the first point. History tells us that unequivocally. But also, when the woke left say that they're left wing, I don't think they are left wing in any meaningful sense. I mean, Helen Pluckrose has talked about this. She's the author of Cynical Theories, which is a book she wrote with James Lindsay about the woke movement, about the origins of the woke movement. It's really worth reading. But she makes this point about how, effectively, the woke side with major corporations and have the support of major multi-billion-dollar corporations. These corporations censor on their behalf. They have the support of governments. They have the support of the establishment, and it's workers. It's people on the minimum wage. It's those people who haven't got the financial resources to protect themselves. They are the victims of cancel culture more than anyone else. We only
Mm.
ever hear about the celebrities, but the vast majority of victims of cancel culture are ordinary working people who don't have the resources or the contacts to protect themselves from it. So, whenever someone gets fired for refusing to go along with an unconscious bias training session at work, or they refuse to accept a visiting speaker who says they're all racist and subject to systemic racism, what will happen is the woke will side with corporations over the workers. We've also seen the woke it's largely an upper middle class movement. It's largely a bourgeois movement. We can hear that from the plummy accents of every Just Stop Oil activist who is caught gluing themselves to a Van Gogh. So, and they don't like the working class. They see the working class as being liable to racism, or you know, they need to, their speech is the one that needs to be controlled. We saw that a lot during the summer riots last time. And as for cancel culture, I mean, Helen Pluckrose has made this point. The only people who can speak out with freedom are those who have got a lot of money. They've got fuck you money. Ricky
Mm.
Gervais, J.K. Rowling, they can say whatever they want because they can't be cancelled. They're uncancelable, right? I'm not saying they don't have a terrible time with all sorts of idiots sending them threats and everything, but I'm just saying they can't be cancelled. So, as Helen Pluckrose says, any organization, any movement that organizes things in such a way that only the super wealthy are able to speak out and sides with corporations against working class people, how is that left wing exactly? What is that not the absolute antithesis of what the tradition of left wing thought is meant to be? What do you think?
Yeah, well, it's hardly the proletariat rising up and shaking off their chains, is it? It's more of a, some people would describe that as corporate fascism. The merging
I
of,
don't think Marx would have supported it, is what I'm saying.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
No, definitely not. Yeah. Do you think that wokeness is, I mean, before we went live, you know, you said that you think wokeness is, people have had enough of it and that the culture war is starting to be lost by that side. Do you still think that's the case? And I mean, or to what extent do you think that's the case? Have we seen the end now? There's been a lot of stuff online in the last sort of year about the end of wokeness and all that sort of thing. How long until we sort of bottom out? And do you think it really
well,
is
I
the
hope
end?
so because the title of my next book, which is coming out in May, is The End of Woke. So let's hope so, eh? But although there's a kind of implied question mark in that title, you know, I mean, the argument I'm making in that book is the argument I've been presenting to you today, which is that authoritarianism never goes away. Wokeness is just the latest manifestation of authoritarianism, and the only protection we have against that is the principles of liberalism. What I mean by that is classical liberalism, not the way that liberalism is misinterpreted today. I think wokeness is dying, is dead, or is certainly on its last legs, insofar as this particular manifestation of authoritarianism won't exist in the way that it has existed. Certainly doesn't have the clout, you know, that it had maybe 2, 3 years ago. I mean, even on a very small scale, you know, when we saw that Jaguar advert, the hyper woke advertising campaign by Jaguar. No cars in it, just a bunch of gender fluid models mincing about with sledgehammers, with phrases like delete ordinary, this weird semantic incoherence. And, you know, and they thought this was radical and vibrant. And of course, that was sort of probably developed during the woke era. And now it went out and it just looked dated. It looked
Mm.
weirdly old fashioned. It looked like something from the 90s or something. It was weird. And it's dated in a matter of 2 or 3 years. It's become outmoded that quickly. And it was interesting. The reaction to it wasn't really outrage, was it? It was like, oh my goodness, how boring, how old-fashioned. You know, it's like the woman who came out as non-binary from Coronation Street last week. It's like people just shrugged. They were like, "Oh, you're 3 years too late, love." You know, it does feel like these things are now gone, and you know what's happened with the Trump administration in America has sort of just escalated it, accelerated it, the demise in America. You know,
Mm.
he was elected on an anti-woke mandate, and he is stripping out DEI and all that sort of stuff. Major corporations like Walmart and McDonald's and Google and Facebook and Meta, they're all taking out their DEI expenditure. It's being
Mm.
stripped out of federal government expenditure in America. But the only way that I think woke can survive is if it becomes a transatlantic conflict, because there are many European governments, including our own, that are so committed to it that they're going to hold out as long as they can. But ultimately, Europe tends to follow America. I don't think it likes to fight with America. And so at the moment, we have this kind of old world versus the new conflict, woke versus anti-woke. I mean, this is obviously very reductive terms, but you know, broadly speaking, that is what's going on. If you saw, you know, I mentioned the Munich Security Conference. I mentioned JD Vance's speech. How do you square that with the speech that Ursula von der Leyen gave last year? I can't remember where at the Copenhagen summit, I think it was, and she talked about the need for greater censorship online. She described it as pre-bunking, not debunking. You need to pre-bunk. In other words, censor the speech before it gets out there. Like that is like that's like
That's
pre-crime, or
pre-crime for
you know, it's like
Minority
one of
Report.
those. It's exactly that. It's Philip K. Dick. She is fully. I mean, this, by the way, is an unelected bureaucrat who has huge powers for lawmaking, and you can't get rid of her. You can't vote her out, right? So, and she's there talking about how and she's talking about she needs a democracy shield to protect people from disinformation. How about her disinformation? How about her lies? What do we get to protect from her? How dare someone who's unelected talk about the need for democracy? Like, it's unbelievable. So, you've got that is being ramped up, and certainly in the UK, the woke movement, that you sense a kind of cornered rat approach. They're lashing out with greater ferocity than ever before because I think they sense that they're dying. But the point that I make in the book is, yes, I think woke is ending. I think it's just a matter of time now. But it will reemerge in some other form. And what I mean by that is authoritarianism always reemerges in some other form. And it might come from the woke, what were the woke left. They might regroup and come back in another way. But at the same time, you're going to get more and more people on the right uh, pushing for authoritarianism. I know we've heard it from ethno-nationalists and Christian nationalists and MAGA supporters as well. Like, so you will get, it will come back. When we talk about the woke right, I don't think that's an oxymoron. I think there are people on the right who are every bit as obsessed with group identity and race and the need to censor and the need to revise history and purity spirals and hatred of the Jews. Like, you see it in equal measure on the far left and the far right. So it just depends who's in power. So, I think, yes, to summarize, yes, wokeness is coming to an end. That's the subject of my next book. But something will replace it. And what I'm trying to do in that book is to try and explain where it might come from and how we can be vigilant against it. It is that thing of the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. That, I suppose, if you like, it would be the best way to summarize what I'm saying.
Andrew Doyle, thank you very much. I think we'll leave it there. Where can people find?
Thank you for having me.
It's been my pleasure. Where can people find you, and where can people buy the book when it's available?
Well, the book will be available for pre-order in a matter of weeks. So it's called The End of Woke. So please do pre-order that. But also you can go on my Substack. It's just andrewdoyle.org. And that's the best way to follow what I do. I do a couple of articles every week. I normally do one free one and one paid one per week. So if you become a paid subscriber, you'll get access to everything, including all the archive. It's only $5 a month, It's just basically the price of one of those overpriced soya coffees that you get. So it's not a big deal.
Who's going to serve our coffees in Pret?
Sorry?
Who's going to serve our coffees in Pret? Who's going to serve our sandwiches in Pret? Sorry, you just reminded me of that woman on Question Time some years ago.
Oh, I didn't see her. I didn't see her.
I have to send it to you afterwards. It's a classic. When you said
send me
earlier,
the clip. That's not a reference I know. Send me the clip.
Oh, you'll have to have a look. It's when you mentioned earlier, you can always tell by the accents. The sort of the woke mob. They're usually sort of middle class. Well, this was the perfect exemplar, really. So. Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Oh, really? So okay. Well, please send me that clip because I think that would be. I'd really love to see that. Yeah, the posh thing is, that woman who was arrested for throwing tomato soup at the sunflowers.
Oh yeah.
Didn't she have the poshest name? She was Indigo Rumbelow or something. It was the most extreme, caricatured posh.
Exactly
that. Exactly that. I mean, you remember the Colston Four? Do you remember that when the Colston Four were on trial for tearing down the statue of Edward Colston during the Black Lives Matter riots?
Yeah.
And one of them was called Milo Ponsford, and another one was called Sage Willoughby. It's like, are you trying to these are characters I would invent? This isn't real, right? It's absolutely hilarious to me that the woke movement can be sort of encapsulated by these really posh, overprivileged, upper middle class people berating everyone about privilege. It's so funny. They're so funny. They're just self-satirizing.
They're not working class lads like us, are they?
Exactly. Come to my Substack because and come and disagree with me. This is what I want. The comments are open to paid subscribers, and it's where I refine my ideas. And I often put an article out there where I'm sort of I write it in a kind of in the best way I can, the most persuasive way I can, sometimes I'm not 100% sure that I'm right. And it's just a really good way, because then people often come back and tell me where they think I'm wrong, and you can have the debate. But because people are paying this nominal fee to subscribe and comment, it means you don't just get people calling you an evil far right fascist. And I don't, so it's not like X. You can have an actual discussion. And so I would say come to my Substack. It's andrewdoyle.org. That's where you can follow me, and my book will be out very soon. So I would be very grateful if people supported that.
Andrew Doyle, you're a legend. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.